This is a very big story, and I must confess that the timeline was much longer than what you're seeing, but it's always my goal just to have one piece of paper. And so the story of E.C. Warriner is very, very complex. There's many different movements that he's a part of. But I just want to begin by focusing on the time when he was the superintendent. So that's the part that's highlighted on your handout. From 1899 to 1918, E.C. Warriner was the superintendent of Saginaw schools. And you can see that in 1910, he organized the Michigan branch of something called the American School Peace League. And I'm going to talk about what that is, but that's really important. He organizes that in 1910 when he is superintendent. Then what happens? He's also involved in the women's suffrage movement. There's a wonderful speech of his in the archives of Warriner, which are held by the Clark Historical Library, which is one of the gems of CMU. And women got the right to vote nationally in 1920. Michigan ratified the 19th Amendment in 1919. But you can see that Warriner is definitely supporting that initiative well before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, both by Michigan and by the United States. Tragically, World War I begins in 1914. That's a tragedy for Warriner because, as I've mentioned, he did organize the branch of the American School Peace League. He was a peace activist. And that means something very, very specific. When we hear the word peace, what do we think of? And a lot of people who talk about the peace movement came into that through the Vietnam War. Before Vietnam, there was Korea, of course. And this was a peace movement before World War I. And it was called the Peace Through Law movement. And we're going to talk about what that means. In any case, World War I begins in Europe in 1914. And because Warriner is part of the Peace Through Law movement, he's very upset at that fact. And actually, when he learns about World War I in Europe, he's in Mount Pleasant. He's not yet president of CMU, who becomes president in 1918. But in 1914, he is in Mount Pleasant because he's the superintendent of like a trade school here at Central Normal. He's not yet the president. And he happens to be in town. And there's a speech where he says he's walking through the streets of Mount Pleasant, and he runs into what he calls a common person on the street. Have you heard the news? And they explain war has broken out in Europe. And the common person on the street says, I hope it's so awful that it never happens again. And this, as we'll see, causes a problem for Warriner, not only because he's a peace activist and he had reason to believe that this would not happen, but also because the US enters World War I in 1917. Right before that happens, his son dies. E.C. Warriner's son, Paul, dies in March of 1917 when he's a student at the University of Michigan. And it's not really, from what I can gather in the archives, his son dies from a bacterial infection at the hospital at University of Michigan. And there's some letters that Warriner has with the head of the hospital, as well as research that Warriner was doing on the statistics of how often students died at universities. He made a study of this. So this is a very intense time for him. His son dies, then the United States enters the war in April of 1917. He learns that he's been elected president of Central in October of 1917. And he begins his presidency on April 1st, 1918. And some of you may know, because I think some of you were there yesterday, we did raise this flag that you see in front of Warriner Hall, in part to honor the 100th anniversary of President Warner's presidency here at CMU. So I just want you to be aware of all of this that's going on before he assumes the presidency of Central Normal. So Central began as a teacher's college. And the way that Warriner got involved in the Peace Through Law movement was, again, through the American School Peace League. Peace through education is a term that I want you to be thinking of. Peace through education, very important to Warriner. You can see the last item on the highlighted bit says May 1918 Sedition Act. And in fact, what happened after the United States entered World War I, and this really began towards the end of 1917. It began, people were being fired in New York for speaking out against the draft. There was a draft, a conscription act. People were being fired, teachers were being fired, and eventually Congress passed an act called the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to challenge the government's ability to wage war by speaking out against the draft. This was this went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court, in a very famous case called Schenck versus the United States, unequivocally said when a country is waging war, the right to speak out, the right to free speech, yields. That is, the right to wage war trumps the right to free speech. Of course, that's changed. And if you've seen the movie The Post, you know about the Pentagon Papers, that jurisprudence has changed. But that's very important for Warriner because Warriner is a peace activist. And he's coming to lead a teacher's college at a time when it's somewhat dangerous to talk about peace, to teach about peace. That's a whole different topic, but I want you to be aware of that background. The other thing on the handout is a picture of Warriner Hall when it was dedicated in 1939. And you can read the inscription there. It says that Warriner was too sick to attend the dedication of the building. And so his wife attended instead. And you can see what the plaque on Warriner Hall looked like originally. This, he retires in 1939, and this is an article about his retirement, and it mentions the bronze tablet in front of Warriner Hall. It says, the bronze tablet on the front of the building will be merely a physical reminder of a great educator, a helpful counselor, and a good friend. This actually is a video from last year. As President Ross, this is a screenshot. And you can see the plaque is sort of blackened and gray, and that's a more close-up picture of it. But now, actually, they have cleaned the plaque in honor of the 125th anniversary of CMU. And so please do notice it. They have cleaned it. The President's Office and Facilities Management undertook this task. And so the plaque has been restored to, I think, what it looked like in 1939. And I just wanted to share that with you. You may have never noticed it before. And actually, when we were raising the flag yesterday, Steve Jessmore, who is a wonderful photographer for University Communications, said, "Oh, is that a new plaque?" And I said, "No, they've just cleaned the old plaque." So there's some symbolism there, and I just wanted you to be aware of that. So as Marcy mentioned, the story of how I literally stumbled onto Warriner is quite interesting. And it's a long story, and I'll just give you a sort of brief version of it. As some of you know, I take students to The Hague, the Netherlands. The red dot is where that is. And actually, Randy Olson, who's sitting in the front, is an alum, and there's some students in the audience who will be going to The Hague this summer. And it was really going to The Hague. I've been going to The Hague since 2011 with students. And that's really how I started to learn about Warriner, by going abroad. I've been at CMU for 20 years. Okay? Never planned to study Warriner, was never on my radar or anything like this. But why do we go to The Hague? We go to The Hague because it markets itself as the international capital of peace and justice. Why? Because there are a number of international courts in The Hague, including the International Criminal Court, which you may have heard of. Okay. Apart from the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, which I'm sure you've heard of, has a court called the International Court of Justice. And the International Court of Justice operates in this building. This building is called the Peace Palace, and it's the most iconic building in The Hague. The Hague is the capital of the Netherlands. When most people think of the Netherlands, they think of Amsterdam. But The Hague is the capital of the Netherlands. It is where the seat of government is. And this is the most iconic building in The Hague. Yes, the United Nations Court operates in that building, but this building was built way before the United Nations. That is before World War II. It was built before World War I. It was built in 1913, and it was built with money provided by a great American, Andrew Carnegie, who was a peace activist. We know of him as an industrialist. Maybe you know of him as a philanthropist, because there are many Carnegie foundations. But he was also a peace activist, and he gave the money to build the Peace Palace. Why was this building built? And this is actually the class from 2014. We're in front of the Peace Palace wearing CMU regalia, and actually there's Randy, who's sitting in the front with the sunglasses on. So it's really this building that began my inquiry. I didn't know this story. I didn't know about the Peace Palace. I went to The Hague because of the International Criminal Court. I knew about that. I didn't know about this other story about the Peace Palace. And so I didn't know that Carnegie built it. And so when I began to learn about it with students, and I think I stress that because I think it's really, really important for students to learn with professors. That's sort of what I'm doing now with my education. There's so much that we don't know. And basically what I'm doing now is processing my ignorance. Okay? I am ignorant about that. So what do I do with this? I don't know about this story. How do I process my ignorance? Well, I start to read about it and read as much as I can and learn as much as I can. And that's how I was led to Warriner, literally, you'll see. So in processing my ignorance, I came across, you can ask me more details later, but the short story is I came across this newspaper article. It's from the New York Times, 1912. And it says, Peace Day becomes a national holiday this week. And I don't know if you can see it, but it says, anniversary of the first Hague Conference. So the first Hague Conference opened on May 18th, 1899. And this was very important for people because what happened at the 1899 Hague Peace Conference was the first international court was built. That international court still exists, and it was a court, how can I say, to, I hate to say end war. It's more like, at this time, people thought countries should have a more humane way of solving their problems. So we need to create some international institution. We need to build something. The phrase actually was organize the world. I think that's so poignant. We all say we need to get organized, okay? And so the insight was the world needs to get organized. This is not a good way to solve problems by going to war. So we need to build like a court. The analogy was always with dueling. At one point, the way that individuals solved their problems was through dueling, and whoever shot first won. That was eventually outlawed. And so people said, look, if we can outlaw dueling amongst individuals, then we should outlaw that same kind of behavior amongst nations. So we need to create an institution. So at the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, that was done, and a court was created. It was called the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and the Peace Palace was built for that. This was huge in the United States, huge. People thought, wow, and they wanted to sort of spread the good news, and they did that by organizing a day where you could educate people about this new court. With the International Criminal Court today, we have these same days. We have International Justice Day, which is like July 17th. And these are days that provide opportunities for people to learn about these courts. So I came across this article, and I was like, wow, we celebrated Peace Day. We were like celebrating the Hague Peace Conference in the United States. Wow. And in the article, it mentioned something called the American School Peace League. I didn't know what that was. And that picture is actually a picture of this book, if you want to look at it. Here it is. I couldn't find anything about the American School Peace League, and so I just went on to one of my favorite websites, abebooks.com, which sells like sort of rare books. And they had the yearbook to the American School Peace League. It was like $30, and I bought it. I didn't know what I was buying. And it basically tells the story of what it is. And what was the American School Peace League? It was a coalition. It was a coalition, a national coalition of teachers, administrators, and students who were committed to the goals of the Peace Through Law movement. That is, you replace law by building international institutions, creating treaties, and also promoting international understanding through education, etc. So the American School Peace League was this American phenomenon. And basically every state in the United States had a chapter. Every state. And so when I got the book, I just, opened up to the Michigan. You can look at it at the end, and it has like every state and when the state organizes its chapter, who the leadership is. And I opened it up to see Michigan, and it says organized at Bay City, October 28th, 1910, President E.C. Warriner, Superintendent of Schools, Saginaw. And then Vice President is C.T. Grawn, President, Central State Normal School. And even though it says Michigan and it says Warriner and Grawn, I'm just like, it can't be. I'm just thinking, really? Like, it's like, is it like the people here at CMU? Is that the same? Like, the evidence is pretty good, it's the same, right? But for some reason, I'm like it's not clicking. And so then I just said, I need to go into the archives. I need to go into the Clark Historical Library. And I went into Grauman's archives, which is really, there's nothing there. But Warner's archives are literally a treasure trove. It's thousands of papers, and there's not enough years in the life. I've been in those archives maybe 20 times. I've spent many hours in those archives. And actually, next semester, I'll be doing an honors seminar where we're going to go into the archives. Students will go into the archives and look through some of these papers. There's so much there. One thing about Warner is he's a great curator of ideas. Apart from the value of his own speeches, he has so many collected quotes and sayings, and he's just a curator of ideas. So that's the story of how I stumbled onto him. And I first started to go into his archives, I think, in 2012 or 2013. And I'm still processing my ignorance. So we can now turn the page over, the handout. And this talk is about the moral vision and values of E.C. Warner. But I also wanted to point out that today, April 4th, is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King, actually, a year before he was assassinated, in 1967, also on the same day of April 4th, gave a talk, a very famous talk, against the Vietnam War. And he uses the phrase revolution of values in several places, and sometimes this speech is called the Revolution of Values speech. But I believe there's the longer quote I have up here, but if you just look at your handout, it's the shorter version of the quote. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. And that very much sums up the moral vision of E.C. Warner. I mean, I'm going to spell it out in more detail, but moving from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. If you want a sort of big picture, Warner is about that. How does he spell that out in particular? I'm in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. I'm trained in philosophy, in ancient Greek philosophy. And Warner himself was also trained in classics. He has a wonderful, actually long essay on Socrates. And one of the values that you see for Warner is the love of knowledge and the love, this is actually Warner's handwriting, the love of the intellectual life, as he calls it. He has a speech called The Love of Knowledge. You can actually Google this. But if you're intrigued by his speech called The Love of Knowledge, I highly recommend that you find the original in his archives, which is much more interesting than the one that was eventually printed. There are two different versions. But you can see the love of intellectual life, the love of knowledge. It's very important that he does not mean, and he says this explicitly, he criticizes people who think of the love of knowledge as the love of scholasticism, of just like Latin and Greek. And although Warner was trained in Latin and Greek, he said, this is not what I mean by love of knowledge. Well, I think what he really means is like love of understanding. And he gives an example of someone who works in a factory who's working on a machine, and how that person should understand how the gears work and why this part rather than another part, and rather just instead of mechanically doing something. And so Warriner is stressing this kind of engagement and understanding with one's surroundings. He's not just talking about book learning, although that's very, very important to him. This is a lovely piece from his archives where he's written necessity of continued study. And in his archives, there's many, like I said, he's a great curator. And he has many pieces of paper like this where he's typing up what someone else has written to remind him. Okay. And so in this little piece, someone is about to go teach on Sir Walter Scott. And his daughter is like, what are you doing? And the teacher says, well, I'm preparing to teach on Sir Walter Scott. And the daughter says, well, haven't you taught that before? And the teacher says, yes, that's why I'm preparing again, because I have to keep coming into contact and reviving it. It's not just like reading something once. You have to continue to come back to it again and again. So I love that. This necessity of continued study, lifelong learning, and the love of the intellectual life, definitely part of Warriner's values. This is another thing. This is actually, I think, on your handout. Yes. If you look at B on your handout, this is just from the archives. He says, I think the best work I ever did at Saginaw was in stimulating our teachers to growth and study. I mention this that you may feel confident that I shall try to put the scholarly attitude foremost in the faculty at Mount Pleasant. So again, this love of learning and continuing to learn, always being a student, processing your ignorance throughout your life. Another one of his values, he's definitely not an elitist. There's a wonderful sort of story he has in the archives about a garbage man. This is also ironic because when Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was in Memphis because he was supporting the sanitation workers who were on strike. So there's a kind of poignancy here, because also in Warriner's archives, there's a story of a garbage man. And the garbage man notes that there's a bird in the tree, and he's trying to communicate this to the homeowner whose garbage he's tending to. And the homeowner realizes that the garbage man is trying to express something, but is having a difficult time doing it because he doesn't have the vocabulary. But the homeowner realizes that the garbage man is a kind of poet and calls him Mr. Keats. And the garbage man says, no, the name's Smythe, not Keats. Okay. In any case, you see this garbage man repeated in Warriner's papers. And this is a quote, "Is it necessary to be a college graduate to have culture? No. The garbage man proves this." It's about appreciating beauty, and anybody can do this. This is also something that you see in Warriner's vision. So he's not an elitist. He's not just about learning Latin and Greek. It's about understanding and appreciating beauty, so important for him. Next, it says the importance of things unseen. As I said, he's a great curator, and this is actually a speech I highly recommend that you look it up, by Calvin Coolidge, called The Importance of Things Unseen. And I'm just going to quote a little bit of it, which is the part on your handout. "We do not need more government, we need more culture. We do not need more law, we need more religion. We do not need more of the things that are seen, We need more of the things that are unseen. The importance of things unseen. And by religion, this is not on your handout. This is actually from William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Again, from Warner's archives, he's a curator. How Warner understands religion is the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. Warner was moved by this, which is why it's in his archives. So it's when you're by yourself and your relation to something, whatever you consider to be divine, that's religion. So we need more of that, the importance of things unseen. So we've talked about the love of knowledge, the importance of the intellectual life, but not in an elitist way. The importance of things unseen, and this big one, peace and universal brotherhood. Okay, it's another part of Warner's moral vision. On your handout, it says, by means of education, courts, and international treaties. In his archives, he says, this is the first quote, peace movement not to add another burden to curriculum, incidentally through history and literature and May 18th. So don't have like peace movement. Do it through history and do it through celebrating May 18th. The longer quote after that explains, I think, why history. The teacher should have a viewpoint which will lift him out of his narrow surroundings and remind him, and this is my emphasis, of the great procession of forward-looking movements which demand his attention. I want you all to be informed on the question of worldwide peace. I want you to realize that this is part of your obligation as well as that of the statesmen of the world. Thus we may all live to see the day when war shall be outlawed, when nations turn to the world court to lay their causes as naturally as men now hail their neighbors to court for any private grievance. May God hasten this happy hour. And he gives that in 1923, and the world court that he's talking about is the Permanent Court of International Justice, which was the court of the League of Nations, okay, which, this is really, I mean, again, I'm processing my ignorance about the League of Nations. I don't know much about the League of Nations. But that's the court he's talking about. And as we know, that court failed. The story is because of World War II. Does anybody know the first country that actually left the League of Nations? That formally left the League of Nations? And what year that was? It wasn't Germany. It was Japan. It was Japan, and it was in 1933, I think. And Germany followed shortly thereafter. Presciently, the Koreans were warning the League of Nations. The Hague, they're in the Hague, they're warning about Japan. Nobody listened. Okay. So Japan was the first. And so here you have Warner telling, this is a commencement speech for teachers, this is your obligation to know this. And we're now on a path where we're trying to build institutions and courts that solve these problems just the way that human beings solve their problems with each other. So states need to do that. Lastly, the value of optimism and never give up. For some reason that didn't make it into the slide. But he does say that it's in vogue among educators to be pessimists. That's the sort of like trend, is for academics to be pessimists. And he says you should not. You should be an optimist. And this relates to the quote, this longer quote about the teacher should have a viewpoint. The great procession of forward-looking movements. I really think that Warriner saw through history progress. So he's there, he's aware of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. In 1899, he organizes the American School Peace League in 1910. World War I happens, the United States enters World War I. There's another court, the World Court. He's not, like other people at the time were saying, we can't do this. And he continues his optimism and his vision that we can solve this problem through building international institutions and international understanding. I was also asked to talk about how Warriner's vision is sort of implemented today by some of the work that we do at the Center for International Ethics. And as I mentioned, we do go and we take people, students, to The Hague and learn about this history. Another interesting thing that we've done is Europeana 1914 to 1918 is actually a database that was created by the European Union and Oxford University in partnership. It's a database of memorabilia from the public regarding World War I. So perhaps you have, a uniform or a box or a postcard. So this project actually went around various cities in Europe, and the public would come in with their memorabilia. And the memorabilia would be registered into this public database, which you can go on. And at The Hague, at the Peace Palace, which has probably the most famous library on this pre-World War I peace movement, they know nothing about the American peace movement. Nothing. Okay. And it was very important that somehow we get into this memory of World War I, this database, that there was a peace movement in the United States that was questioning World War I. And so we did actually submit some of Warriner's papers into this database. So if you go onto this database, I hand selected some of them, and there's thousands of papers. But certain ones were selected and they're explained. And there's a link at the bottom of your handout which will take you to those papers. But this is the process. This is actually at the Peace Palace Library. You can see the librarian is handling the archives with white gloves, and he's basically scanning Warriner's papers into this database. The Clark Historical Library worked with me and allowed these papers to be sent to The Hague. They wouldn't give them to me, okay? So they had to be protected by a courier. They would be a FedEx, and they were scanned into this database. So that's me sort of giving them, explaining to them what these documents are. And this is a video where we're selecting the documents. You'll actually see Randy is in this video as well. We're talking about the documents. We're reading some of the documents. And you can go onto the database and look at these documents. And there we're putting them into the envelope. And that's where they went. The Peace Palace Library, there's the project. And I'm sort of signing off as the intake form. Those are actually the women in the scarves are CMU students. They're now graduated. And the other thing that we do is we do raise the flag. The flag is from 1897. This was the first year that we raised it in 2015. So you see President Ross and my colleague Andy Long from the Department of Philosophy and Religion. And this flag, if you're interested, there's a brochure which explains not only the symbolism of the flag, but also the reasons why we have raised it every year at CMU. This flag is so interesting because the colors were chosen because no country was using this color combination. And the people who designed this flag were very aware of the importance of the need for a visual symbol. The person who designed this flag actually had done work with the Red Cross. And you know, everybody recognizes that symbol. The Red Cross is a symbol for neutrality. That's what the Red Cross is. The Red Cross actually, the aim of it is a peace movement, actually, if you look at the archives. But the Red Cross is about not firing onto medics. They're neutral. So they wear that special symbol so that you don't fire onto them. And that's why firing onto things with that symbol is a war crime. Okay? So that had to be created. That was someone's idea to do that. The idea was, let's try to begin to build peace by not killing the people who are tending to the war wounded. And so that symbol became very important. But there was no symbol. The Red Cross stands for helping people during wartime. There's no symbol for the peace through law movement. This is really a symbol for peace through law, the international arbitration movement. So the colors were chosen because no country using those colors. And the other wonderful thing about the flag is that, I don't know if you can see, but above the shield, there's two hands, they're shaking hands, and there's wings that are coming off of the hands. And the designers of the flag explicitly say that that is the hand of a man and a hand of a woman. The idea being men and women must work together in fellowship if they're going to actually raise humanity to a higher level. This is in 1897. This is before women have any formal political voice. So the insight was, if this is to happen, you have to have women being at that table. Okay. So we've raised it now for 4 years. We raised it at the Peace Palace as well. And this is a flag that was the flag of the movement that Warriner was involved in. So that is, I think, all that I have, yes. And if you're interested in more, in addition to the Europeana documents, there are videos. We've done several talks on Warriner. I've done some talks with the Clark Historical Library. They're all recorded, and the links are there for you should you want to further educate yourself. Thank you very much.